The entrance denied. The sleek, modern lobby of Hathaway and Reed Consulting exuded an air of exclusivity. Polished marble floors gleamed under the warm glow of recessed lighting, and the faint scent of fresh espresso wafted through the air from the high-end coffee bar tucked into the corner. It was a place of order, discipline, and rigid professionalism. A place where first impressions weren't just important. They were everything. And that was exactly why Jason Cole chose to walk in unannounced. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored dark suit, stepping past the automatic glass doors. The morning sunlight cast a soft halo around his broad shoulders as he strode inside with quiet confidence. His posture was straight, his expression calm, but beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of curiosity, a question that he wasn't sure he wanted answered. For years, Jason had built his company, Cole Dynamics, from the ground up. His sleepless nights, his sacrifices, his relentless determination, each had played a role in transforming a small financial analytics startup into one of the most formidable firms in the industry. He had just finalized the acquisition of Hathaway and Reed, a strategic move that placed him at the helm of one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the country. And yet, as he walked into the lobby of his newest asset, he was met not with recognition or respect, but with a gatekeeper who didn't even bother to glance up. "Excuse me," he said, stepping up to the reception desk. The woman behind it, a meticulously put-together blonde in her mid-50s, barely spared him a glance before returning her gaze to her screen. The nameplate on her desk read Karen Whitmore, Executive Receptionist. "Yes?" she asked flatly, still typing. Jason's lips curled slightly, a quiet amusement flickering in his dark eyes. He wasn't the type to demand attention, but the dismissiveness was unmistakable. "I'd like to meet with someone from the executive team," he said, his voice even. Karen finally looked up, her sharp blue eyes assessing him with a flicker of impatience. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. Jason shook his head. "Not exactly. But I do have business here." That caught her attention. For the first time, her eyes swept over him properly. Dark, well-tailored suit, confident stance, expensive leather briefcase. Yet, something about him still seemed to put her on edge. "Business," she repeated slowly, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Yes," Jason replied, his tone patient. Karen exhaled sharply, clearly unimpressed. "Sir, we don't accept walk-ins," she said, already reaching for a laminated card from a neatly stacked pile on her desk. "If you're looking for job applications, you can visit our website." Jason blinked, his amusement giving way to something colder. "Job applications," he echoed, arching an eyebrow. She nodded, extending the card toward him without another thought. "Yes, we don't take in-person submissions anymore. Everything is online now." Jason let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm not here for a job." Karen's lips pursed, her patience thinning. "Then what exactly is your business here?" she asked, her voice clipped, the subtle irritation no longer masked. Jason debated telling her outright, just saying the words and watching the entire foundation of her assumptions crumble beneath her. But instead, he leaned against the counter slightly, tilting his head as if genuinely curious. "I'd like to take a look around," he said simply. Karen scoffed, before she could catch herself. "Sir, this is a professional environment. You can't just walk in off the street." Jason's expression didn't change, but something in the air did. He straightened, his gaze locking onto hers. "And what makes you think I'd walked in off the street?" Karen hesitated. She hadn't expected that. She blinked, her fingers twitching slightly against the desk, as if already regretting how that had sounded. But rather than backtrack, she doubled down. "We have policies, sir. No unscheduled visitors. If you don't have an appointment, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Jason said nothing for a long moment. The silence in the room seemed to stretch as a few employees walked past, their eyes flickering toward the exchange, but quickly looking away. No one intervened. Then, before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Oh my God, Mr. Cole." Karen's head snapped toward the voice as a young executive, probably mid-30s, rushed forward. His suit was sharp, his badge gleamed under the lobby lights. Ethan Clark, VP of Operations. The color drained from Karen's face. Jason watched it happen in real time. The way her back stiffened, the way her breathing grew shallow, the way her brain pieced together what she had just done. Ethan reached them, his expression a mix of excitement and panic. "Mr. Cole, I didn't know you were coming in today," he stammered, his hands gesturing awkwardly. Jason turned to him with a casual nod. "Didn't think I needed an appointment to visit my own company." Ethan swallowed hard. Karen went completely still. A few employees in the distance had stopped pretending not to watch. The weight of her mistake was already sinking into her expression, though she hadn't spoken yet. The silence was deafening, stretching between them like a chasm she couldn't cross. She blinked rapidly, her hands folding tightly in front of her. "Wait, you're him," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason just looked at her. The way her face paled, the way her hands clenched around the desk, he had seen it before. Ethan cleared his throat, stepping in to diffuse the situation. "Mr. Cole, I can personally assure you that this is not how we typically treat visitors." Jason turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Ethan hesitated, because the truth was, he couldn't be sure. And everyone standing there knew it. Karen's lips parted, desperate to salvage the situation. "Mr. Cole," she started, her voice softer now, polite now. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding." Jason tilted his head, watching her carefully. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. She nodded quickly, her hands tightening over the desk as though it could ground her. "Yes, of course. I didn't recognize you, that's all. If I had known." Jason's expression didn't shift. His voice remained calm. "If you had known what exactly?" Karen hesitated. Ethan was shifting uncomfortably beside her, fully aware of how bad this looked. The receptionist who had dismissed him as a job seeker was now stumbling over her words, desperate to cover her tracks. A few employees had their phones out. Text messages were already flying across departments. Jason let the silence stretch again, watching her face, watching the fear creep into her expression. Then finally, he asked the question that would haunt her for a long time. "Tell me something, Miss Whitmore. What about me made you so sure I didn't belong here?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because she knew. And her silence was answer enough. The weight of assumptions, the silence in the lobby was suffocating. Karen Whitmore had always prided herself on being efficient, professional, and in control. But at that moment, sitting behind the polished marble desk of the reception area, she had commanded for years, she felt none of those things. The weight of her mistake was pressing down on her like an invisible force. She had dismissed Jason Cole, the owner of the company, as just another job seeker. She had assumed, without question, that he didn't belong. And now, there was no undoing what had been done. Jason stood there, his gaze steady, unshaken, unreadable. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding anything. But the look in his eyes, it was worse. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. A cold, undeniable realization that this wasn't the first time this had happened. Karen swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the desk as if it could ground her, but she knew there was nothing to hold on to now. Ethan Clark, the young executive who had recognized Jason, was still standing beside them, awkwardly shifting his weight. His face was a mixture of anxiety and damage control, his brain scrambling to figure out how to fix this before it spiraled any further. "Mr. Cole," Ethan started carefully, keeping his voice light, as if pretending that this was just an unfortunate mix-up could make it so. "I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding. Karen here was just following policy, of course." Jason raised a hand slightly. Not aggressively, just enough to stop Ethan mid-sentence. "Tell me, Ethan," Jason said, his voice level, smooth. Is there a policy that says you turn people away based on what they look like? Ethan's face turned several shades paler. No, of course not, sir. That's... He trailed off, unsure of how to recover. Jason slowly turned back to Karen. Miss Whitmore, he said, his tone almost casual, what did you see when I walked in here today? Karen's throat went dry. She hesitated, feeling hundreds of eyes on her, even from the employees who pretended to still be working. Her mind was racing for something, anything, that could smooth this over. But Jason just stood there, waiting. And the longer he waited, the heavier the question became. When she didn't answer, he nodded slightly. That's what I thought. Karen opened her mouth again, but what could she even say? How could she explain what had no explanation? That she had looked at a man, seen his skin color, his presence, the way he walked into the building without hesitation, and had just assumed. That she had placed him into a category before he even had a chance to speak. That her instinct was to turn him away, to push him back out through those glass doors, because some deep part of her already decided he didn't belong. She couldn't say that. So she said nothing. Jason let out a slow breath and straightened his suit jacket. I think I've seen enough for today. Ethan's eyes widened. Wait, Mr. Cole, sir. He rushed to follow him. But Jason was already walking past the reception desk, past the employees who hurriedly pretended to be engrossed in their screens, and toward the elevator. Karen sat there, stunned, as he pressed the call button. Then, just before the doors slid open, he turned slightly, just enough to glance back at her. Miss Whitmore, he said quietly, how many people have you turned away before me? Her chest tightened. And before she could answer, before she could even think of a lie that might save her, the doors closed. A silence that wouldn't fade. The moment Jason disappeared from sight, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't just that he had caught her. It wasn't just that she had made a mistake. It was that every single person in that lobby had witnessed it. The employees, the junior executives, the visitors who had walked in during the exchange. They had all seen what had happened. And no one was going to forget it. Whispers had already begun. Karen could feel the judgment, the text messages being sent. She could feel the looks, not just from the people who worked with her, but from those who had likely experienced the exact same treatment, but had never been in a position to call her out. Her stomach churned. Karen, Ethan said quietly, his voice laced with something between pity and disappointment. She turned to him. What? She snapped. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You do realize you just insulted our boss, right? Karen's mouth opened, then closed. Their boss. Not just a random businessman. Not just some guy. The owner. Her superior. The man who now had every reason to fire her. A sharp click-clack of heels approached, and Karen barely had time to brace herself before she heard the cool, measured voice of Amara Fields, the firm's director of human resources. Karen Whitmore, Amara said, her tone so neutral it made Karen's skin prickle. Karen turned slowly. Amara, tall, elegant, with dark skin and piercing brown eyes, looked at her the way a prosecutor might look at a guilty defendant who had already sealed their fate. Come with me, Amara said. Karen's blood turned ice cold. What, right now? She asked, trying to sound composed, but her voice cracked just slightly. Amara tilted her head. Was that unclear? Karen's fingers tightened into fists, her heart hammering. This wasn't just about Jason Cole. This was about what she had done before him. How many employees had filed complaints? How many potential clients had walked out of that lobby because of her assumptions? And now, it was too late to cover any of it up. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaky as she followed Amara toward the HR office, fully aware that the entire lobby was watching her go. The elevator ride up. Meanwhile, Jason stood in the elevator, his hands in his pockets, watching the numbers on the panel climb higher and higher. This wasn't new to him. He had been underestimated before, overlooked. assumed to be less than he was. But now he had power. Not just financial power. Control. And that changed everything. The doors slid open to the executive floor, where his real team was waiting. Alicia Reynolds, his new chief of operations, stood just outside his office. She already knew. She had been watching from the security feed. She saw everything. "Well?" she asked. Jason let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You already know," he muttered. Alicia pursed her lips. "Karen Whitmore. On her way to HR as we speak." Alicia hummed in approval. "Good. We should also start reviewing her past interactions. I've already seen some concerning patterns." Jason's jaw tightened. "Let's make one thing clear," he said. "This isn't just about her." Alicia nodded. "Good," she said, "because we both know that if she felt comfortable enough to say that to you, it means she said it to others before." Jason exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "And this time, it ends here. The reckoning begins." The executive floor of Hathaway and Reed Consulting was a world away from the bustling, glass-walled lobby below. Up here, silence reigned. The walls were lined with modern, minimalist art, and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, casting long shadows over the pristine glass desks and leather chairs. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was charged. Jason Cole stepped out of the elevator, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights. He had seen enough. Alicia Reynolds, his newly appointed chief of operations, was already waiting outside his corner office, her arms crossed, her posture as sharp and efficient as always. She had watched everything unfold on the lobby's security cameras, and she hadn't been surprised, not in the slightest. She tilted her head as he approached. "So, how was the welcome committee?" she asked dryly. Jason let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. "Predictable," he muttered. Alicia smirked, but her gaze was calculating. She had been in this business long enough to recognize the rot beneath the polished surface. "Karen Whitmore is being sent to HR," Jason continued, walking past her into his office, where a sleek mahogany desk sat in front of the massive skyline view. "But I don't just want to deal with her. I want to dig deeper." Alicia followed him inside, closing the door behind her. "Already ahead of you," she said, tossing a thick folder onto his desk. "I had our team pull up internal records last week, before you even set foot in this building." Jason picked up the folder, flipping through its contents. Hiring statistics, promotion patterns, exit interviews, complaints. His jaw tightened as he scanned the data. The numbers told a story, a very familiar story. Alicia sat down across from him, watching his face as he read. "Notice anything interesting?" she asked. Jason let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh yeah," he murmured. "It's about as bad as I expected." A pattern was emerging. The majority of senior executives, white men over the age of 50. Women in leadership roles, less than 10%. Minority hires, mostly in lower-paying administrative positions. Complaint reports filed about bias in promotions and hiring, ignored. Karen Whitmore's name, linked to multiple complaints over the last 5 years. Jason snapped the folder shut. He had spent his entire career fighting for a seat at the table. And now he owned the whole damn table. But clearly, the old guard wasn't ready to let go. "They don't even realize how deep this runs," Alicia said, tapping a finger against the folder. "This is just what we found at first glance. There's more, a lot more." Jason nodded, setting the folder aside. "Then let's get to work." HR's toughest meeting yet. Meanwhile, down in the HR department, Karen Whitmore sat stiffly in a chair in front of a glass-walled office. She felt exposed, vulnerable. She wasn't used to this. She had been the one in control for years, the gatekeeper, the one who decided who got to enter and who was turned away. And now she was on the other side of the desk. Across from her sat Amara Fields, the firm's HR director. Amara's dark brown eyes were steady, her manicured nails tapping lightly against the desk as she reviewed a document in front of her. Karen cleared her throat, her palms sweating. "So, is this just a routine review?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain professional. Amara didn't look up. "No." Karen's throat tightened. Amara flipped the document shut, finally meeting Karen's gaze. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice controlled but firm, "how long have you been with this company?" Karen straightened. "Almost 15 years." Amara nodded, her fingers interlacing on the desk. 15 years, she repeated. "Which means you've been at that front desk for a long time." Karen forced a stiff smile. "Yes. I've seen this company grow from a small operation to..." Amara raised a hand, stopping her. "I'm sure you have. And in that time, how many people have you decided weren't qualified enough to step through those doors?" Karen blinked. I don't understand what you mean." Amara's eyes were piercing. "Oh, I think you do." Karen's chest tightened. This wasn't just about today. It wasn't just about Jason Cole. It was about a pattern. A long, ugly pattern. And now, the reckoning had begun. Jason calls a meeting with the old guard. Back in the executive wing, Jason strode down the hallway toward the boardroom, where the senior leadership team was waiting. These were the old men in suits who had built Hathaway and Reed on their terms. They had never expected to answer to someone like him. And now, they were about to be reminded who owned the company now. The moment he entered, the air in the room shifted. The executives, all white, all older, all men, looked up as he walked in. Some of them adjusted their ties. A few cleared their throats. None of them knew what to expect. Jason didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the long glass table, rolling up his sleeves. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, "we have a problem." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Mr. Cole, one of them, Frank Davidson, the firm's COO, spoke up. "I assume this is about the little incident in the lobby." He forced a chuckle. "I assure you, it was just a misunderstanding." Jason tilted his head slightly. "Oh," he asked, "because I've looked through the company's hiring and promotion records, and from where I'm sitting, that incident is a symptom of something much bigger." Frank coughed slightly, clearly uncomfortable. "With all due respect, Mr. Cole, Hathaway and Reed has been in business for over 30 years. We have always maintained the highest level of professionalism." Jason let out a sharp laugh. "Professionalism," he repeated. Frank hesitated. Jason leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I walked into this building today, the building I own, and was immediately assumed to be a job seeker. That's not a misunderstanding, gentlemen. That's a culture problem." The silence in the room was heavy. Jason continued, "And here's what's going to happen. We're not sweeping this under the rug. We're cleaning house." One of the executives, Howard Klein, frowned. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Jason's eyes darkened. "I mean this company is about to change, starting today. And if anyone in this room has a problem with that..." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. "There's the door." Silence. Some of the men visibly stiffened. Others looked down, because they all knew the game had changed. Jason wasn't just here to be a figurehead. He was here to tear down what was broken and build something better. And they could either get on board or get out, breaking the old guard. The boardroom was deathly silent. Jason Cole stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, shoulders squared, his presence undeniable. Across from him, the senior executives of Hathaway and Reed Consulting sat stiffly in their tailored suits, their carefully curated expressions ranging from unease to outright discomfort. Jason had just delivered the final ultimatum. Either they adapt or they leave. Frank Davidson, the firm's COO, was the first to break the silence. He leaned forward slightly, clearing his throat as if that would somehow dissolve the tension. Mr. Cole, he began, his voice carefully measured, we understand that today's situation in the lobby was unfortunate, but I hardly think it's a reason to upend the company's entire structure. Jason simply raised an eyebrow. Unfortunate. That was the word he was going with. Jason folded his arms, leaning against the edge of the table. So let me get this straight, he said. You think what happened downstairs was an isolated incident? A fluke? Frank gave a tight smile. I believe it was a misunderstanding, yes. Jason let out a short, humorless chuckle. That's interesting, Frank, because I've been looking at patterns, and from what I can tell, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was standard practice. A shift in the room. Some of the men exchanged nervous glances. Jason continued, his voice growing sharper. Let's talk numbers. Out of all the senior leadership in this company, only 7% are women. Less than 5% of promotions over the last 5 years have gone to minority employees. And let's not even get into the hiring process, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like an exclusive country club. Frank opened his mouth, but Jason wasn't finished. Let's not sugarcoat it. This company, my company now, was built to keep people like me out. You all had your little empire, your little boys' club, and it worked for a long time. But guess what? Jason's eyes swept the room. It's over. The old rules don't apply anymore. Frank's face hardened. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? Jason's smile didn't reach his eyes. You're about to find out. The purge begins. Within 2 hours, emails were sent. By the end of the day, 8 senior executives were asked to resign, including Frank Davidson. By the end of the week, the company's internal leadership structure was completely unrecognizable. Jason had no intention of wasting time. The moment he took over, the old regime's time was up. He wasn't here to ease anyone into a gentle transition. He was here to rip out the rot before it could fester any longer. And he didn't hesitate. Alicia Reynolds, his chief of operations, watched it all unfold from her office with an approving smirk. Well, she muttered, watching as one of the executives walked out with his box of personal belongings, his face still in shock. That's one way to make an entrance. Jason sat across from her, leaning back in his chair. No point in dragging it out. She chuckled. You know this is going to send shockwaves through the industry, right? Jason shrugged. Let it. Alicia smirked. I have to say, it's refreshing to see someone actually take action, instead of just talking about diversity initiatives and calling it a day. Jason's expression turned serious. This isn't about diversity initiatives. This is about making sure qualified people actually get the opportunities they've been denied for years. She nodded, leaning forward. So, what's next? Jason exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. Now. His gaze darkened. Now, we rebuild. Meanwhile, in the HR office, Karen Whitmore sat stiffly in the HR meeting room, her fingers tightly clenched in her lap. She had never been on this side of the table before. She was always the one with power. She had spent years deciding who was worthy of stepping through those glass doors. And now, she was waiting for her fate. Amara Fields, the firm's director of human resources, sat across from her, expression unreadable as she flipped through a thick stack of papers. Finally, Amara set the file down and folded her hands together. Miss Whitmore, she began, her voice even. Do you have any idea how many complaints have been filed against you over the past 5 years? Karen stiffened. Complaints. Amara nodded. 52. Karen's stomach dropped. 52. Surely that was impossible. She had never been written up, never had a formal warning. But Amara was already flipping through the pages. Most of them were ignored by previous leadership, dismissed, swept under the rug. But they're here, in writing. Karen's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to argue, to say this was unfair, that she had only ever followed protocol. But deep down, she knew exactly what kind of protocol she had followed. Amara continued. So let's talk about today, she said, tilting her head. You turned away the owner of this company because you assumed he wasn't important enough to be here. And when you realized your mistake, her lips pressed into a thin smile. You scrambled to save face. Karen swallowed. I didn't know who he was. Amara raised an eyebrow. Would you have treated him the same if he looked different? Karen froze, because that was the question she couldn't answer. Amara exhaled and leaned forward. Miss Whitmore, let me be very clear. There is no future for you at this company. Karen's breath caught. Wait. This isn't up for debate, Amara interrupted. Consider this your final notice. Karen's face burned. Her world was crumbling. She had spent years ruling over that front desk like a queen. And now, she was being escorted out of the building like she was nothing. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she had done. And for the first time, she had to face the consequences. Jason's first day in power. As Karen was escorted out of the building, Jason stood in his office, overlooking the city skyline. There was still work to do. His phone buzzed. A message from Alicia. HR purge is complete. Next step. Jason exhaled, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. They had cleaned house. But now they had to build something better. He typed back. Start bringing in the right people. Because Hathaway and Reed wasn't just going to be another corporate dinosaur stuck in the past. It was going to be something new. Something better. Something built for everyone, not just a privileged few. And this was just the beginning. The aftershock of change. The echoes of Jason Cole's actions reverberated through the entire company like a thunderclap. In less than 24 hours, Hathaway and Reed had undergone a seismic shift, and everyone felt it. The executive suite was no longer a sanctuary for the old guard. The senior partners who once dictated the culture from their glass-walled offices were gone. Their plush leather chairs sat empty. Their names were removed from the company directory. Their carefully curated legacies, wiped away in a single day. And outside those walls, in the open floors of middle management, the tension was thick. Conversations were whispered, eyes darted across hallways, and emails were drafted with unprecedented caution. Everyone knew that if executives weren't safe, then no one was untouchable. The message was clear. Hathaway and Reed was no longer a fortress for complacency. HR's internal cleanup. Amara Fields had never seen this much activity in HR. Usually, her team was buried in paperwork and bureaucracy, but today, they were making history. Karen Whitmore was just the beginning. Her removal had triggered a deep audit of the company's records, and what they found was even worse than expected. Unresolved discrimination complaints spanning over a decade. Pay gaps that weren't just trends, they were policies. Patterns of managers only promoting the right fit, which just so happened to exclude people of color, women, and anyone they deemed not Hathaway material. And worst of all, a culture that had silenced anyone who spoke out. Amara sat at her desk, her fingers tapping against the sleek surface, as the HR review reports stacked up in front of her. She glanced at the numbers, then at the names. Then she picked up her phone. Send termination notices to 6 more employees, she told her assistant, her voice firm. And schedule mandatory leadership training for every department head. I don't care how senior they are. Her assistant hesitated. Even. Yes. Amara's jaw tightened. Especially him. There was no room for hesitation. The old Hathaway and Reed had thrived because no one had ever been held accountable. That era was over. The new blood arrives. The day after the purge, Jason stood in his office as the first wave of new hires arrived. Alicia had spent the entire night going through resumes, portfolios, and references, searching for the right people to replace the vacancies left behind. She stood next to Jason now, flipping through her tablet. Here's our first round of replacements, she said, scrolling through the list. Top talent. People who actually deserved to be here, but were overlooked. Jason raised an eyebrow. Overlooked by the old guard. She nodded. Yep, some of them even applied before and never got callbacks. You'd be surprised how much talent was passed up because they didn't fit the mold. Jason didn't need further explanation. He already knew what that meant. Alicia continued, "We've got a data analyst who developed some of the most innovative financial models in the industry, but they were ignored because they didn't come from a target school. A marketing strategist who transformed two struggling firms, but was told she was too aggressive for a leadership role. And a former VP who left her last company after she kept getting passed over for promotions while her male colleagues got fast-tracked." Jason scanned the profiles. Each name represented exactly the kind of talent the company should have had all along. People who had been ignored, underestimated, and dismissed. Not anymore. "Get them in," he said simply. "Give them real roles. And make sure everyone knows. This isn't a diversity hire stunt. This is about getting the best people in the right positions." Alicia smirked. "Already ahead of you. They start Monday." Jason nodded, satisfaction curling in his chest. For too long, Hathaway and Reed had been a closed-door empire, a fortress for people who all looked, acted, and thought the same way. Now, those doors were being ripped open, and the people they had ignored for years, they were about to take their rightful place at the table. The company reacts. The reaction to Jason's changes was immediate. Some employees were thrilled. Finally, someone was addressing the deep-rooted problems that had been whispered about for years. Others, not so much. In the upper floors, where mid-level managers still operated under old-school mentalities, there was panic. "I don't know if I can work under these new policies," one senior consultant grumbled to a colleague over coffee. His colleague sighed. "Yeah, I mean, should we really have to walk on eggshells now? Feels like everything's about wokeness these days." A voice cut through their conversation. "Or maybe," a younger analyst said, setting down her mug, "it's about making sure actual talent gets recognized instead of the same old golf buddies getting promoted over and over again." The senior consultant's face flushed. "That's not what I meant." "Sure," the analyst said, unimpressed. "Keep telling yourself that." The divisions were starting to show. There were those who embraced the change, and there were those who clung desperately to the past. Jason knew exactly how this would play out. Some people would fight the new culture, and they would lose, because this wasn't just about him. This was about building something bigger than himself, a company where talent mattered more than privilege, a company where no one was turned away because of assumptions, a company where walking into the lobby didn't mean being judged before you even spoke. And that kind of company, it didn't just survive. It thrived. Jason's final statement. As the week came to a close, Jason sent out one final company-wide email. It was short, direct, powerful. Subject: "Welcome to the new Hathaway and Reed. To all employees. This company was built on decades of tradition. Some of those traditions were worth keeping. Others, not so much. The time for exclusivity is over. The time for real talent, real leadership, and real opportunities starts now. If you are here to build something better, we welcome you. If you are here to resist change, you know where the door is." Jason Cole, CEO. By the time he hit send, the entire company was talking. And just like that, the old Hathaway and Reed was gone. And in its place, something new was rising. The battle beyond the walls. The first wave of change had hit Hathaway and Reed like a tsunami. The old guard was gone, the gatekeepers removed, and the new era had begun. But Jason Cole knew one truth about power. It never shifts without resistance. Change wasn't just about removing obstacles. It was about holding the line when the forces of the past fought back. And they were about to fight back. The corporate world reacts. Jason's restructuring of Hathaway and Reed had sent shockwaves through the corporate world. The finance and consulting industry wasn't built for rapid, disruptive change. especially not the kind that forced powerful men out of their cozy seats at the top. Within days, articles started appearing on business news sites. Radical shakeup at Hathaway and Reed. New CEO ousts longtime executives. Jason Cole, a visionary or a corporate wrecking ball. Can Hathaway and Reed survive its most aggressive overhaul in history? It was predictable, inevitable. The former executives, the ones Jason had forced out, weren't going down quietly. They had connections, influence, friends in high places, and now they were plotting their revenge. The old guard strikes back. Jason was in his office when Alicia stormed in, her expression tight with controlled fury. "You're gonna want to see this," she said, tossing a folder onto his desk. Jason flipped it open. Inside were emails, internal memos, and leaked communications from Hathaway and Reed's former executives. They were organizing a counterattack. They were contacting clients, trying to turn them against the new leadership. They were pushing industry insiders to label Jason as a reckless disruptor. And worst of all, they were trying to pressure the board into removing him. Jason's jaw clenched. How much traction do they have? Alicia exhaled. Enough to be a problem. Jason leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had known they wouldn't go quietly. But this was war. He wasn't just fighting internal culture anymore. Now he was fighting the entire system. The boardroom showdown. 2 days later, Jason found himself in the war room, Hathaway and Reed's massive boardroom on the top floor. Seated around the long, glass table were the company's major shareholders and board members. Some were allies, some were not. At the head of the table sat Gerald Langston, the chairman of the board. He was a powerful man in his late 60s, old money, old school, and deeply resistant to change. Langston folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "Jason," he said smoothly, "we need to talk." Jason remained standing. "Then let's talk." Langston's lips curled slightly. He gestured to the folder in front of him. "There's concern," he said. "Your changes, while, shall we say, ambitious, have created some unrest in the industry." Jason didn't blink. "You mean the old executives I fired are running their mouths?" Langston chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Investors are nervous. Clients are nervous. We're already seeing rumblings of account withdrawals." Jason tilted his head. "Let me guess, you're suggesting that I slow down, that I course correct." Langston steepled his fingers. "What I'm suggesting is that perhaps you've made enough changes for now." The room fell silent. Everyone was watching. Jason exhaled. This was it. The moment where most CEOs caved. The moment where the board reminded them who really controlled the company. But Jason didn't back down. He leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. "You want to talk numbers? Let's talk numbers." Alicia, seated near the end of the table, slid a report across to the board members. Jason continued. "Since I took over, we've increased efficiency by 14%, cut executive deadweight, and hired the most qualified leadership this company has ever had." Langston didn't flinch, and yet clients are still leaving. Jason's eyes darkened. "Oh, you mean the ones who were only here because their buddies ran the place?" He let the words hang for a moment before adding, "Good. Let them go." The board members shifted uncomfortably. Jason wasn't playing the game they expected. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't begging for their approval. He was forcing them to acknowledge the truth. "This company was built on a rigged system," Jason said. "And you all know it. The reason these clients are leaving. Because for the first time, they don't have an unfair advantage anymore." He straightened. "I didn't come here to keep the status quo. I came here to build something real. And if that makes people uncomfortable," he shrugged, "so be it." Langston studied him, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. Then he smirked. "Well," he said after a long pause, "at least you're not a coward." The tension in the room shifted. Langston sat back, his expression unreadable. "I'll give you 6 months, Cole," he said. "You prove that your changes are profitable, and the board will support you." Jason met his gaze. "Deal." He turned to leave. Then, just before exiting, he paused. "Oh, and Langston." He glanced back. "If any more of your old friends try to sabotage this company, I won't wait for 6 months." Langston chuckled. Jason walked out, unchallenged. The final push. After the board meeting, Jason returned to his office. Alicia followed, her arms crossed. "Well?" she asked. Jason sat down, rubbing his temples. "They're giving me 6 months." Alicia whistled. "That's better than I expected." Jason nodded. "Yeah, but we still have a war to win." He leaned forward. "I want an aggressive expansion strategy. We lock in the best talent, we bring in new high-value clients, and we make sure that when those 6 months are up." He met Alicia's gaze. "We own this industry." Alicia grinned. "Now that," she said, "is a plan I can get behind." And just like that, the next phase began. The legacy he built. The clock was ticking. Jason Cole had 6 months to prove that his vision for Hathaway and Reed wasn't just an ambitious dream, but a force of reality that no one could deny. 6 months to silence the doubters. 6 months to lock in victory. 6 months to cement his legacy. And the world was watching. The final battle begins. From the outside, it looked like Hathaway and Reed was thriving. The new hires had settled in. Productivity had skyrocketed. The toxic culture was being dismantled piece by piece. But inside the upper floors, the real battle was still being fought. The board wasn't waiting for 6 months to see results. They were already testing Jason, looking for any excuse to undermine him. Every decision he made was scrutinized. Every strategy was questioned. Every single misstep was magnified and weaponized. And then the first real blow landed. The scandal that wasn't. One morning, Jason walked into his office and found Alicia waiting for him, her phone in hand, her jaw clenched. "We have a problem." Jason exhaled, setting down his coffee. "What now?" Alicia handed him her phone. "This." Jason's eyes narrowed as he read the headline. "Cole's diversity push creates chaos at Hathaway and Reed. Industry insiders say it's too much, too fast." Beneath it were anonymous quotes from former executives, clients, and even current employees, painting Jason's leadership as reckless. They called his restructuring a witch hunt against the old leadership. They claimed he was replacing experience with unqualified hires. They said clients were fleeing because the company had become too political. Jason's jaw tightened. "Let me guess, who's behind this?" Alicia's eyes flashed with anger. "The same people you fired." Jason clenched his fists. Of course. They couldn't beat him inside the company, so they were trying to destroy him from the outside. He took a slow breath, setting the phone down. "All right," he said calmly. "Let's remind them who they're messing with." Turning the tables, Jason didn't play defense. That was what they expected him to do, to scramble, to explain himself, to apologize for daring to shake up the system. But he wasn't built that way. Instead, he did what they feared most. He took control of the narrative. Within hours, Hathaway and Reed launched a public campaign, not an apology tour, but a power move. Exclusive interviews were scheduled with major business outlets. High-profile clients who supported Jason's changes spoke out in favor of the transformation. Hathaway and Reed released statistics showing that performance metrics were already surpassing previous years. And the final blow. Jason himself went on record, live, on national television. The interview that changed everything. The interview took place in a sleek, modern studio, the skyline of the city glowing in the background. Sitting across from him was Diane Cormack, a veteran business journalist known for tough interviews. She leaned forward, her expression sharp. "Mr. Cole," she began, "your leadership at Hathaway and Reed has been controversial. Some say you've moved too fast. Some say you've dismantled a successful company. What do you say to them? Jason didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. I say they're wrong. Cormac raised an eyebrow. That's a bold statement. Jason smirked. I make bold moves. That's why I was brought in. Cormac glanced at her notes. You fired half the executive team. You restructured the entire hiring and promotion process. And now, there are reports of clients pulling their contracts. Jason tilted his head. Let's talk about those clients. She nodded. Go ahead. Jason looked straight into the camera. The clients that left. He said, they weren't here because Hathaway and Reed was the best at what it does. They were here because their friends ran the place. Because they had special access, special privileges, and a special comfort zone they didn't want to leave. He shrugged. So, yeah, they left. And you know what? I don't want them back. The silence in the studio was electric. Cormac blinked, momentarily caught off guard. So you're saying? I'm saying we're done catering to an exclusive boys' club, Jason said. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, good. Cormac's lips curled slightly. She was impressed. And what about your hiring changes? There are concerns you're prioritizing diversity over merit. Jason let out a short laugh. That's cute, he said, shaking his head. You know who never got questioned about merit? The dozens of mediocre executives who sat in their seats for years, doing the bare minimum and getting promoted because they fit in. He leaned back. So let's be real. What we're doing isn't about diversity hires. It's about finally hiring the best people instead of the same people. Cormac nodded slowly. And you believe this approach will be successful? Jason smiled. I don't believe it. I know it. And just like that, he flipped the narrative. The headlines changed overnight. Cole fires back. We're done catering to the boys' club. Hathaway and Reed CEO isn't apologizing. And investors are listening. New leadership, new era. Cole's gamble might just pay off. The people who wanted to bury him had just made him a legend instead. The moment that defined everything. Back at Hathaway and Reed, Alicia met him in the hallway after the interview aired. She crossed her arms, a rare grin on her face. Well, she said, that was one hell of a way to tell them to go screw themselves. Jason chuckled. It needed to be said. She nodded, then handed him a report. Investors just responded to your interview, she said. Jason skimmed it. Then he stopped. His eyes flickered up to hers. Our valuation just went up. Alicia smirked. Yep. Clients are coming back. New investors are interested. And the board. Jason waited. They're backing off. For good. Jason let out a slow exhale. He'd won. Not just the company. Not just the battle. He'd won the right to lead on his own terms. And for the first time in decades, Hathaway and Reed wasn't a gated kingdom. It was a place where anyone, no matter where they came from, could walk through the front door, be seen for their talent, and rise to the top. And that was the legacy Jason Cole built. That was the future.